Hi everybody, Adam Steele from Hot Pole Studios here, and today is a video where I'm going to talk about monitors, speaker monitors. This video is brought to you by Eve Audio, who've just sent me these lovely new SC207s. But this video in particular is not actually about these. These have just prompted me to think I should probably do a video illuminating why different monitors do different things. When is it appropriate to spend a certain amount of money on monitors? Why do people have massive ones? Why do people have small ones? When should you at home spend money on things? So let's dive in. It's a whole big broad topic, monitors and monitoring. And this is probably going to be kind of a broad overview, and I'm going to try my best to describe what I think would be best for you in your situation, because my situation is almost definitely not your situation. Even if you're a professional studio owner, your size of live room might be different to mine, your requirements for what you need might be different to mine. So let's just go back to basics for a second. I know this might seem a little kind of patronising to some of you, sorry about that, but let's start from the start so we're all on the same platform, okay? What is monitoring? Monitoring, to me, is being able to hear what's going on with the artist, with the band. It's not necessarily to do with the equipment that is involved, although of course it is as a knock-on effect. The whole thing about monitoring is, whatever the system is, can I clearly hear everything that's going on so I can make decisions about whether I like the sound, whether it be volumes or whether it be effects or whether it be balance or anything that is to do with recording an artist, recording a voiceover, mixing, mastering, any of it. Monitoring is about being able to hear what's going on. Now, to that end, different people have different requirements. The number one requirement is, where are you? What's your situation? Are you someone who's going to be traveling all the time and on the go, which means that you're probably going to need to do monitoring on headphones. This video isn't about headphones specifically, but they have their place. Or are you monitoring somewhere where you're not allowed to make any noise, or where that would be inappropriate for any reason? Headphones are the choice available to you. Beyond that, it's nice to have speakers. Why don't most people in modern tracking and mixing situations just use something like an old hi-fi? Because your old hi-fi might sound great. Why not use that? Well, this is where we get into the weeds a little bit, because sound great is incredibly subjective. With a hi-fi and with a consumer listening to songs, something sounding great can mean any number of things, and they are all completely valid. If you like loads of bass in your living room stereo system with the subwoofer cranked up, you do you. If you don't like that, if you like it quieter, again, fine. If you're one of those people who has like a 5.1 surround system with the Dolby up mixing thing, the Dolby Pro Logic, again, if that's what you like to do, people will likely disagree with you, but what you want to do for your personal stuff is entirely up to you. The problem when we come to tracking instruments, singers, bands, mixing, mastering, is that it's not about how good it sounds coming out of your speakers. It's about how evenly it gets reproduced across anybody's speakers or headphones that you send it to when you are finished. Which then begs the question, well, how do we do that? And that's the reason why I have 3 sets of speakers behind me. I use a monitor controller from Audient, the Nero, which means that I can switch between different speakers. I have a subwoofer under the console. I have currently Adam A7Xs up there, but they're going to be replaced now with the Eve SC207s. I'll come back to that in a minute. I've got copies of Yamaha NS10s, the old Studio Spares SN10s, and I've got an Auratone in the middle there. And they all serve very different purposes. In my case, the main ones are the ones in the middle there, which give me a very accurate, full range description of everything that's going on in the sound, and the subwoofer extends that low end for me so that if there's anything wrong in that range, I can tell very quickly without having to make the main monitors do too much work in the low end. That's where we start talking about cost, and again, I'll come back to that in a minute. The outside pair have pretty much no low end at all and are designed more like traditional hi-fi speakers. They're quite kind of boxy, they're very mid-range focused. I know of engineers who have used that type of speaker, although usually the kind of the genuine Yamaha ones, to make massive hit records on, and that works for them. Although, again, in my personal opinion, that's not because they're the best speakers in the world. I think that's because those are the speakers that those guys have got to know the best. We'll come back to that. And the middle one is the Auratone, which sometimes is colloquially referred to as a grot box. That has no low end in at all, no high end, no tweeter. It's in mono because it's right in the middle. And the idea is if I switch to that speaker and everything that's being played comes out that sounding balanced enough that it doesn't sound wrong, then I'm generally happy with the overall balance of that song. It's just a checking tool, and I would never mix on that most of my time. So different applications for different speakers. And then there are even bigger speakers than my what are called near field monitors. There are midfields and far fields, which is where you start to get those really big scary things. Generally speaking, those are really expensive, but they're the kind of thing that you would see in big commercial studios where it's not just about the engineer at the front, i.e. me, getting in the perfect kind of sound spot, but quite often it's about making sure that the band behind you, the producers, A&R man, all the rest of the team, get a big, loud wall of well-balanced, of course, accurate sound, but in a way that makes them happy, because if they're usually bigger, they're further apart, quite often mounted up in the walls. That gives a much wider sweet spot for the stereo image, which means that more people can stand in that stereo image and feel like they're getting the right kind of panning, the right kind of balance from that. In this room, that kind of thing to me is overkill. So let's talk about rooms, because this is where we start talking about not only the room, but where should you spend your money. To me, those two go hand in hand. Part of monitoring is not just the speaker, like I said before. The rest of monitoring is the environment that you are in. Because the sound that comes out of a speaker, it comes out and it hits your ears, but it also scatters out in all directions. If you're in a room that isn't properly treated, that can cause some major problems. And honestly, most people's rooms that they work in are not properly treated. I mean, there's a sliding scale, of course. If you've got monitors that are kind of small-ish, don't have tons of low end, you would think that would make the bass easier to kind of not have a problem in a room with, but often that's not actually the biggest issue. If you, for instance, put your speakers in a small room like a back office, it's got walls that are painted, those walls are going to echo, and those echoes, some of them will enhance certain frequencies hitting your ears, some of them will cancel certain frequencies hitting your ears. And you'll find that what you're hearing isn't just the speakers, but it's everything. And it can be quite unbalanced by the time it gets to you. And that can really subconsciously affect your decision making, which means that you're fighting the system before you've even begun. And so what can happen is no amount of money that you spend on monitors will fix that situation. Because with monitoring, the overall quality of your monitoring comes down to the weakest link. What is the weakest link in your chain? And generally speaking, again, in my experience of talking to people who've asked me loads of questions about what should I buy, what should I upgrade, I usually say, well, send me a photo of what you have. And 9 times out of 10, the room sucks. Don't worry, there are things you can do. With well-placed acoustic treatment, you can not necessarily fix, but kind of alleviate and remedy a lot of major issues in pretty much any room. As a general guideline, the louder your monitoring is, the more I've found that problems with the room come into play. So if your room is kind of well treated but you don't monitor super loud, that could be more than enough. If you run a studio and you have clients, you're probably not going to be monitoring at whisper quiet volume, because you need to please the other people. They need to be able to hear what's going on, which means that then the room comes into play and then the issues start to build. So, coming back to what should I buy, my advice would start with what is your budget? And that doesn't mean look at your bank account, find the biggest number you can, that's what you have to spend on speakers. No. What you should do is be completely honest with yourself as to how much you can spend over a period of time, because if you're going to get into tracking and mixing, you're going to be doing this for a long time, right? That's the idea. So don't waste money on things that will not help, but at the same time don't go cheaping out on the things that are going to matter and that you're going to have to end up buying things twice. So let's talk priorities. One thing that you have to prioritize if you're monitoring with speakers is you need a pair of speakers. You just do. Sounds obvious, I know. But they don't have to be the most expensive thing in the world. How much of your room needs treatment? And then look as a cost at where your speakers are going to go. Because if they go too near a wall, the wall itself is going to vibrate, and that's going to turn into something akin to an acoustic guitar, which is really going to start booming at certain frequencies and again messing up your accurate listening on whatever the song is. If they're too close to the desk, quite often that can cause a problem as well. I used to use acoustic foam to separate things. That makes a small difference. It is a difference, but it's not the biggest. And I now actually have my speakers on spikes, just because in my situation, my console is up there. And so if I start adding more and more height, that starts to get out of the premium kind of sweet spot of where the speakers should be. I know they don't look like they're in the perfect place on this camera angle, but I can assure you if the camera was here, you'd see that these are, the perfect 30-degree angle. I'm exactly an equidistant triangle away from my main monitors. The others, less ideal, but you have to compromise somewhere. One of the things that I did a year after being in here is I realised we had put the console right up against the wall, and that was causing the speakers to be quite near to the wall. I dragged everything out by nearly a metre, a good 3 feet, and that made the room feel smaller, which isn't ideal, but the fact that I got everything so much further away from the wall had a huge impact. Suddenly the stereo imaging was clearer, suddenly the bass was less because the problem with the kind of the acoustic guitar effect type thing that the walls might be doing is that they might reinforce and double some frequencies and they might cancel out some others. And you're not going to know which ones are which without just testing it. Another thing that I've done in here is you can't see just off camera here, but a load of my guitar cabs are now in line with the console going round, because I have a big corner in this room, and the corner was acting like a parabolic reflection dish, and that was really bringing a couple of frequencies out in here that were not ideal. So I used what I already had, things that were heavy, and put them in the right places. Thing about sound treatment is that's where you really, I would recommend, should spend a lot of money, but accept again that certain materials do certain things well and other materials don't do it as well. Watch some videos specifically on acoustic treatment. There are loads of good ones out there, and research a little bit before you go spending your money on like big packs of foam. That acoustic foam does a thing, it might not be the thing you need. You can see again on the back wall here, I do have a fair bit of acoustic foam on this wall, but that's because of the way that this room works. This room was purpose built with low-end absorption and diffusion in mind, so all the floor, wall, ceiling, they all float, which cost us a lot of time and money to do, but we purpose built this place. I appreciate you can't do that with a home, or even a lot of small studios, because we did lose a lot of space in this room. This was significantly bigger until we built it out, but that's the price we have paid, not in terms of money, but in terms of, you know, just accepting that the room is smaller, but the acoustics are way more linear and usable, which means that my monitoring is more accurate, which means I can make those decisions about balance and EQ much more confidently, and they tend to translate much better to other people without me buying more fancy EQs, fancy compressors, fancy preamps, fancy hardware. Yeah, I've got some of that. Yeah, it's nice. But the thing that improved my mixes the most was that I could hear what was going on and hear what the problems were and hear what fixes were needed. Sometimes the fact that I could hear problems properly on the monitors would mean that I could go into the live room while the band was tracking and move a microphone or change out a microphone, or practical things that you can do at the right stage. If you can hear what's going on and you can trust your monitoring system, then you can say, that isn't right, what can I do to fix that? Rather than having to just guess and go, seems fine to me, I'll check it in the mix later, and then having issues to deal with. Having good monitoring at every stage allows you to make those good decisions. So acoustics are a big part of it, and then the next part is something like correction software, and it's all a balance. How much can you afford? What are your limitations? If you have a limitation where there is only so much acoustic treatment you can do, but also you can afford some fairly decent monitors, then you get into the question of, well, what's next? And the next answer for me was Sonarworks. There are other softwares that do a similar thing, but that's the one that I used. It was the first one I became aware of, and it's worked for me. We still push in here to have good monitors like the Eve SC207s. We push to have the room acoustics right, which is why there are bass traps and panels in places to stop flutters and resonances. And beyond that, the small little differences are handled in the software. That's not something we need, but it's something I very much like, that it helps. It's not a cure-all. It should come third in that list, again, in my opinion. Number one should be make sure the room is right. Number two, make sure the monitors are appropriate. And number three, use room correction software for that extra little bit of fairy dust. Now, price point, because there are a lot of budget monitors out there and you think, oh, they'll do, they're really affordable. I find that cheap monitors, you've really got to be careful. A lot of brands do inexpensive models, and quite often there are corners that I find that are cut in the wrong places. That's not to say that's the same for every brand. There are certain brands, and I'm not going to throw any particular brands under the bus. This isn't a negativity video at all, so I'm not going to go naming and shaming. But there are certain brands who make really affordable stuff that, if you listen closely and you know what you're listening for, like the bass has no definition as a good example, which means you don't know things like whether your kick and your bass actually gel together in certain frequencies, because when you turn the volume up to even a reasonable level, they start to all just mush together. The high end in some of the cheaper stuff, it's either hyped, so it sounds quite harsh, which means that you turn the high end down on everything so it sounds better, which means that your mixes end up sounding ill-defined and mushy, or they can go the other way and have no definition, which means that you do what I used to do and I used to be terrible for, which is brighten everything with EQs, whether it's Pultecs or shelves, so that on your speakers it sounds nice and sweet. You play it in the car and it's killing your ears. Evenness is a very prized quality in monitoring. When it comes to monitor design, there are limitations that the speaker designers have to get past. Like the this SC207 right here has two speakers in, a woofer and a tweeter. The reason it has two speakers is that one speaker alone isn't really capable of providing the super low bass and the super high end, so they have to put two in, and the penalty there is that they have to have some kind of crossover in there so that it can say, you deal with the high end, you deal with the low end. And a really well-designed crossover that's built with the right parts will minimally affect what's going on, so that the crossover between the lows and the highs just blends quite well, and hopefully the human ear doesn't pick up on the kind of crossover and the issues between them. And well-designed speakers do tend to alleviate most of that. Some companies use soft dome tweeters, some use the folded ribbon type things, but the idea behind the top end is supposed to be that it's quite kind of straight. But the crossover point, depending on where it's been designed, can be in the same range where things like heavy guitars have a lot of their fizz, and if you don't actually accurately know what's going on there, that can cause issues in itself. That is why I have that Auratone back here, because it's something I can trust, because it has a single speaker and no crossover at all. It doesn't reproduce ultra high end, and it can't really do low bass, but everything in between those, if I accept that it doesn't have those qualities about it, everything in between should be really quite straightforward and linear. It's not going to be perfect. I don't think that speaker has the most absolutely perfect frequency curve on it, but it's incredibly good at producing transients, like hits, and that upper mid spike where the vocal range is, because there's no crossover. It either works or it doesn't, and it's a really good way to check. Similarly, sometimes monitors can be too perfect, which is where the NS10s come in for me. Where the main monitors, they've often got really clever, like, woven carbon fiber designs and folded ribbon tweeters and all the really clever stuff. And they've got things like the Eve has it's got a big hole on the back. That is some sort of horn design which helps extend the low end. That's great, but the upshot can be that because the low end has been extended by the design, that can be detrimental sometimes, where something like the NS10s, they are a sealed box. They have no clever design. They are simple. And that has its own reward, where the low end does not extend on them at all. They just don't have low bass. But they are really quite accurate in terms of their overall reproduction of what an older hi-fi can do. The cones are made of paper, so if you push them quite hard, they bend and buckle and they don't reproduce transients perfectly. And the tweeter on them is a dome tweeter, which again isn't perfect. But if the mix sounds good on a system that isn't perfect, that is quite reassuring, because that means that I've done things right. That can be quite rewarding, but again, that's a lot of money to spend if you're not doing like big, just checking everything all the time. If you're just writing for yourself, that might be absolute overkill. If you're working with people and you are really, really confident in your room and your setup, and you don't need extra speakers, you don't need extra speakers, and that's perfectly valid. I worry sometimes, and I like to check my own work, which is why I have the extra speakers. That doesn't mean that they're the thing for everybody. It might be better for you if you spend the extra money on the higher quality main speakers and don't spend the money on the extra speakers. I'm a gear nerd and I spend far too much money on this kind of stuff, and I accept that that's me, and quite a few people do that too. But that doesn't mean that I think everybody should do that. I know this has been a big long ramble, but just to conclude, if you're starting out, I recommend getting speakers that are not necessarily the biggest, but something that is well made. Something like, and this video is brought to you by Eve Audio, maybe something like the SC205s, which my friend Warren Hewitt reviewed recently. Or if you need something that's got a bit more low-end response, the SC207s. Although do be aware, the larger the woofer goes, you get a little bit more bass response out of it, sure, but the penalty there is that the woofer itself can't be quite as punchy and reactive. Because the larger you go, the speaker has more size to move. That's just physics. And that's why you might be better off, if you're looking at it, you might be better off with 5-inch speakers and a subwoofer rather than 7 or 8-inch speakers, depending on what you want to do. If your room has real low-end issues with room modes, then a subwoofer might be wrong for you, because that might cause all sorts of problems. That was definitely the case for me originally, because I used to run without subs. Then I got a subwoofer in here and it caused some major issues, which I had to kind of redesign some of the bass traps and the acoustic stuff in here and spend as much money on the treatment as I had on the subwoofer just to make things right again. So that's why when I said think what your budget is, it's not just the speakers. So you might be better off getting lower budget speakers and spending the money on the right treatment to go along with that. And then at some point in the future, if you start to hear limitations to your monitors, like maybe the low end isn't reproducing fully enough, or you want more clarity with kind of the next level of speakers, then that might be the appropriate time to do that. But I would again say be aware with the money that you pay for speakers that there's a curve. The ultra low end I just wouldn't, but then there's companies like Kali Audio make some really good budget stuff now that is as good as we used to see in the mid-range 10 or 15 years ago, which is really impressive, which means that guys like Eve Audio have really had to up their game. And I think they are doing so. That's the next tier up, is this kind of price range, which is you're starting to reach beyond the $1,000 mark at that point, which again, if you're serious about doing this, that's where the money goes, is something that you're going to be using for years and years. The next jump is the $3,000 to $4,000 range, then the $10,000 range. So the price really does that. The quality doesn't do that with it. The quality ticks up a little bit and ticks up a little bit. And that's just because beyond a certain point, what are you looking for? You start using 3-way monitors, which each speaker then can more accurately represent its frequency range, but then there are more crossover points potentially. Then you get to bigger speakers, which, like I was talking about with the far fields in big studios, are, in my opinion, crowd pleasers. You start to look at ultra high cost, ultra linear power amps and that kind of thing, which are arguably better than stuff at the mid tier, but the price gets silly. But then is it silly? Because if you're looking at a 10 or 20 year investment and you're looking at doing this as a business and you've got the properly treated room to put them in, that might be where the money should go. That's entirely down to you, but hopefully this has given you a bit of an insight into why I wouldn't just spend all my money on the best monitors I can. I would go with room treatment first, and hope that this helps you down the right path. I know it's been a bit of a long rambling video, sorry about that, but I hope that you learned something and took something away. If you've got any differing opinions, please sound off in the comments below. I would love to hear what you're thinking. Thank you everybody for watching. Hit the like button and share, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff. And I will see you in the next video. And later this year, I'll do a review on these when I've had some time to bed them in, have a listen, get to know what they do, and see how much I like them. Thanks everybody. See you later.
Hey everyone, that might be the end of the video, but if you fancy carrying on this conversation, we have a Discord server, link is in the description. We're also on Patreon, which is something you can really help us with. We also are on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at Hop Pole Studios. See you there.